Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to be here. And I just didn't know to stop.
I can't.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and be able to present for you all. So my presentation is Black Girlhood and the Black Ratchet Imagination. And so this is taken from actually one of the papers that I wrote for my comps, and hopefully it becomes a part of a chapter in my dissertation. Okay. All right, so I provided an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So I want to start by defining what Black Girlhood Studies is as a field, and then talk about the importance of naming and space when it comes to Black girl bodies and identities. And then we're going to talk about the Black Ratchet Imagination as a construct. Then we're going to talk about Meg the Stallion. And then we're going to talk about why it is important for us to engage with the Black Ratchet Imagination and Black girlhood as English scholars. Okay, so the two key takeaways that I want to work through today is how we grapple with the impact of naming surrounding Black girls' identities, their bodies, and their stories, and also begin to think through how to expand or reimagine the spaces where Black girls can be whole and bring their full selves to the table. Okay, so when we think about Black girlhood as both a methodology and as a field, Black girlhood existed long before it became a name or became a methodology. So Black girlhood or Black girlhood studies was birthed out of Black feminist thought. So thinking through 1970s, 1980s, when we had literature thinking about like the Bluest Eye and Toni Morrison, they were dealing with the concepts of Black girlhood, even though Black girlhood was not constructed as an actual methodology. So coming through around the 2000s, within the last 10 years, Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown, who is the founder of Soul Hope, Saving Our Lives Here in God Truth, which is housed in Chicago or Illinois, she created or defined Black girlhood and as a construct and as an organization, and she defines it as the representations, memories, and lived experiences of being in a body marked as youthful, Black, and female. Black girlhood is not dependent on age, physical maturity, or an essential category of identity. So more plainly stated, the vision of Black girlhood is freedom and for Black girls to be free. As an organizing construct, Black girlhood makes possible the affirmation of Black girl lives and, if necessary, their liberation. Love guides their actions and permeates their beings. For those who don't know love, they create spaces to practice Black girlhood and to sense love, to name love, to claim love, and to share it. And so what I want us to take away from the definition of Black girlhood that Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown gives us is, first and foremost, Black girlhood is not limited or bound by the category of age. And that's important to me because when I think about Black girlhood, I think about two separate spaces of Black girlhood. So we have Black girlhood within the age of youth, so thinking about ages maybe 7 to 18. But then we also have Black women who also identify as Black girls. So thinking through what it means for Black women to reclaim that sense of girlhood. And so it's important for her and also important for me to work through that we have these two different generations coming together, identifying under the umbrella of Black girlhood, but working through two different constructs. And what is important for her in her particular organization is that it's not a talking down to. When we think about Black feminist thought and Black girlhood studies, the relationship between the two is more hierarchical. So we have Black women who are prefaced as an authority figure, more so talking down to, giving advice to. But when Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown created her organization, it was important for her to censor voices at the same level. So Black girls are the authority figures of their own lives. And so they are the ones constructing their spaces. They are the ones defining their narratives. They are the ones talking with and working with Black women to produce new futures. And so that was really important. Okay, so Black girlhood studies is also heavily influenced by hip-hop feminism. And so when we think of hip-hop feminism, we point to Joan Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, and she lists 4 particular tenets of Black hip-hop feminism pedagogy that she brings forth in Black girlhood studies. So thinking how hip-hop feminism pedagogy helps to mediate ways that generations cannot recall. So thinking about memory, which is something that I also grapple with the ways that Black girls construct their own stories and construct their own memories, and how memories are both individual and collective. And so when we think about the relationship between black girls and black women, we're thinking about how memories are passed down from generation to generation. And so the ways that black girls define and construct their lives are not solely based on their own experiences, but they're based in the experiences of the women that have come before them that help to influence and construct their identities. And so we're also thinking about how hip-hop feminism pedagogy and also black girlhood and black womanhood is socially constructed, and the influence of society and how that helps to construct the ways that they see themselves, the way that they define themselves. And we also want to think about black girlhood as a political intervention and a political statement, and the work that they're doing around the politics of their own bodies and their own identities, and thinking about it in terms of becoming. So there's never a sense of arrival. They're always continuing to evolve. And then I want to think about it as a political act of resistance, and how black girls are always living in resistance to the ways that they are being defined by society. So they're always living in political terms of resisting against something. And then thinking about it as an organizing construct, and how it allows a production of citizenship that presumes inclusion and active participation of black girls and women, and also interrogates the processes of marginalization as it relates to race, gender, class, sexuality, and age. Okay, so when we think about black girlhood, both as a politic and as a field and methodology, we have to think about it in terms of space and naming. And so when I think about space, I'm not only talking about physical space, but also talking about the body as a geography, which was taken up by Lakeisha Simmons, who is a historian, in her book Crescent City Girls. So thinking about the way that black girls' experiences are not just held within, but they also show up as scars on the body. And I think Hortense Spillers talk about that in her article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. So she talks about the ways that the scars of slavery show up as hieroglyphics of the body, and they're not physical scars, but they're emotional scars and mental scars, and what that does to the identity. And so when we think about the word naming and how naming and space should show up, we also want to think about the ways that black girls' geography shows up on their body and they carry it with them. And then I also want us to think about naming in relation to space, and the ways and the influence that naming has as a marker on identity. So specifically thinking about the ways that black girls are named in communities as good, bad, ratchet, fast, and the impact that those names have on the ways that they construct their identity. And so in this particular space, I was very intentional to not take up politics or respectability for this particular presentation, because I did grapple a lot with that during my comps. And after talking with Dr. Butler earlier this week, I just really felt like politics or respectability was a little bit played and like it's complicated and a lot. And so I think that it's important to not totally discard it, but also find new ways to think about the relationship between black girls and black women outside of respectability, because it carries so much baggage. And it's been taken up in really different ways and that come away from the original purpose. So within Simmons' text, she talks about this idea of good girl theology. So she grapples with the ways that society and community, specifically within the black community, black girls are named, but how black girls name themselves. And so what happens if you are named, if you're giving a particular type of scripted name, for so long, you adopt that as your identity, and how that plays out in your behaviors, how that plays out in conversations of trauma and identity and community. And so that's really what she's taking up here. She talks about the good girl theology, but she also talks about the geography of niceness, which takes up the relationship between class, perception, and environment. So thinking about the ways that class plays into how girls are defined. So if you live in a nice part of town, then you are automatically assumed or perceived as a good girl. If you have a two-parent household, then you're perceived as being good because there are two parents in the home. So thinking about these ways that these factors are perceived by other people, and then they take up and are able to name black girls, and then how they fall into these scripts and what happens if they don't fit the actual script that's being placed upon them. So that's kind of where we're working with when we think about naming and space. And then we transition to think about ratchetness within the conversation of naming and space. So ratchetness, as defined by Urban Dictionary, a great source. ratchetness or ratchetness is a term that's used for someone who is either a hoe, dirty, nasty, ghetto as hell, being annoying, or busted. So depending on what you need to use the term for, that's what you can define it as. And so ratchet politics, which was taken up by Nadia Brown and Lisa Young, really grapples with the original definition of ratchet or ratchetness as being ghetto, real, gutter, or nasty, which was based in New Orleans, which also Crescent City Girls was based in New Orleans. And so we see the South and we see New Orleans as being really a hub of birthing terminology around black girlhood. And so what she's saying when in this particular article, they're really working through how ratchetness emerged in a song and how it originally came about as a derogatory term around black women, but then ratchetness was taken up by black women and the black community in various ways. So we have like the Angela Davis Bury the Ratchet campaign that came about, and then we also see within the community there was an ownership of ratchetness. So there's a tension continuously around how ratchetness is taken up and how it is used. But it's important to think through the influence of class when thinking about ratchetness and how ratchetness was projected as a working class thing. So if you were poor, then you were automatically perceived and labeled as ratchet. And what does that mean and how that ties back into the politics of respectability. So then we have the Black Ratchet Imagination, which was a term coined by another historian, L.H. Stallings, which engages the ways that hip-hop executes a queer performance of the failure that produces empowerment. So basically what Stallings is trying to argue is that ratchetness is a particular script that doesn't fit. And so what happens when we take up this script and use it for ourselves? And she's arguing about it particularly in strip club culture. And so the way that she's breaking it down is she's saying that the way that society has viewed ratchet is negative and has perceived and placed it upon black women's body as saying that black women are dirty. But what happens when black women adopt that for themselves and revamp it as a source of empowerment? And so she's talking about queering in particular ways and looking at hip-hop through a queer lens, because the traditional script around hip-hop is negative and has negative connotations, but the basis of hip-hop feminism is basically saying, like, yes, we acknowledge that this is a thing, but there's also an undercurrent of empowerment that we want to focus on and bring out around hip-hop. So that's what she's basically arguing. So she's taking up Joan Morgan, who has a politics of pleasure, where she's also kind of playing with the idea of black women's sexuality and black women's bodies as empowered instead of sources solely of trauma. And so there's a more recent scholar who, S.R. Tolliver, who I think is currently on the job market. She's graduating. So she expanded the conversation of the Black Ratchet Imagination to think through Black Ratchet Imagination in the sense of black girlhood. So she takes up Afrofuturism. I don't take up Afrofuturism because this is not my lane and I like to stay in my lane. But she does talk through it in the sense of like black girl magic and black girl possibilities. So what would it mean for us to expand the idea of respectability and ratchetness together? So how do we put respectability and ratchetness in conversation that creates space for black girls to be? Because in my mind, the way that I think about black girlhood and black girls are always respectable and ratchet. There's not an either or. And so what happens when we make them stop trying to pick and fracture their identities and bring them together as one, a whole self? So that's basically what we're arguing. So I try to invoke the Black Ratchet Imagination to deconstruct the idea of categories for black girls. So what would it mean for them to be whole instead of fractured, instead of having to put themselves back together? Which brings me to Meg Thee Stallion. So if you don't know who Meg Thee Stallion is, she's a Houston rapper. She has several aliases. She was heavily influenced by Pimp C. And so she's Meg Thee Stallion, aka Tina Stowe, aka Hot Girl Meg. But she's a recent cultural phenomenon. But for me, she serves an example of what happens when black girlhood and Black righteousness come together in modern terms. And so she released her EP Tina Snow in 2018, and she's overtly and confident sexuality. So she's an example for me, or a modern example of sexuality and what it means to own your body, what it means to own your identity, but what it also means to bring your full self to the table. So, Meg Thee Stallion rose to fame through her hashtag Hot Girl Summer. And when we think about hot girl, the way that she defines it is that being a hot girl means being unapologetically you. It means having fun, being confident, living your truth, being the life of the party. And then the other tweet says the hot girl summer was a reminder to love yourself, secure the bag, have fun with your friends, be creative, and make time for romance. So when I think about Meg Thee Stallion, I think about how Meg Thee Stallion is unapologetic. When she first came out, everyone only placed her in this group of a hypersexual rapper. And then people found out that she liked anime. So it was like, oh my God, how could this rapper who is overtly sexual like anime? And then she talked about how she wants to write her own horror film, and how she was currently in school getting a health administration degree because her grandmother told her that she had to get a degree to make sure that she had something to stand on. So thinking through how Meg Thee Stallion doesn't fracture herself, she presents her whole self brings her whole self to the table. So yes, she loves sex, and she loves her body. She loves education. She loves her family. She's securing the bag in every area of her life. And how can we use what Meg Thee Stallion is bringing to the table to teach other Black girls about how to bring their full self to the table, instead of breaking this script of having to separate or fracture yourself? How we have to show up one way in academics and then show up one way at home. What happens when we bring our full selves to the table? All right. So why does this matter for us as English scholars? So thinking through the idea that we have to bring our full self, bring our fractured selves to the table, I hope to look at the coldest winter ever as an example of the ways that English education and English literature scholars are taking up urban fiction, and what would it mean for us to teach urban fiction in classrooms? So for me, The Coldest Winter Ever was like my first book. I read it in middle school. I had to sneak and read it because my mom didn't know about it. But it was like one of those books alongside The Bluest Eye that allowed me to see myself. And so if we are saying that we're scholars and we're intersectional and we are trying to be intentional about teaching our students, we are doing them a disservice if we aren't bringing literature in the table that allows them to see themselves. So thinking about what text we are teaching in our classrooms, and if we actually are engaging the text that students use outside. So like, what does it mean if they're already reading the text? Why can't we bring those texts into the classroom to allow students to see themselves? So to end, I want to look at this poem by Morgan Parker from her text, There Are Things More Beautiful Than Beyonce. So she has this poem, and it's entitled, There Are 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Girl. And so within this poem, she gives all of these different adjectives. So she talks about being at risk, pretty, Queen Latifah, Nikki Giovanni, Mom, Tina Turner, sex, dyke, ugly, bitch, sex, mama, Nene Leakes, Sally Hemings, thought, Erykah Badu, bipolar, Beyonce, Nicki Minaj, sex, rape, Whitney Houston, Toni Morrison. There's a whole lot of different words. But what was significant to me about the poem is that, one, she uses in this particular poem, she brings trauma and pleasure together. They're not separated. And I think that's significant when we think through Black girl identities, about not having to separate trauma. I know one of the things that I grapple with in writing around Black girlhood is not letting trauma being the only script or narrative for Black girls, and how do we bring trauma and pleasure together within the narrative. And then she also includes different identities, and so what would it mean for us to create space that the multiplicity of identities of Black girls are able to coexist together. And so the questions that I grapple with, or that I'm currently grappling with, are like, how do we create productive spaces for Black girlhood experiences that don't focus solely on the narrative of trauma, and how do we hold the complexities of trauma and joy together? And then how do we think through methodologies of Black girlhood that grapple with naming, but also exist outside of naming? So thinking through the fact that names mark particular moments, but names also expire. And so what we do, so ratchetness, what happens when ratchetness is no longer a thing? So yeah, that's it. Thank you.